Hi, everyone. I'm Iulia Marin. I'm a senior business strategy analyst at Autodesk on the Genuine team. And the fun fact about me was that when I was a kid, I really wanted to grow up to become an archaeologist. I'm very passionate about history and mummies and anything that has to do with like Indiana Jones movies. So today I'm going to talk about how we built and implemented a data metric framework at Autodesk. I have a few slides to go through, but I'm trying to keep it a little bit more conversational. So before we get started, I'm just going to introduce Autodesk a little bit, speak about who we are and what we do. So Autodesk is a company who makes software for people who make things. We are a global leader in design, and we make software for a number of different industries, ranging from architecture, engineering, construction, manufacturing, and media and entertainment industries. So if you watch any animated movies, chances are they were probably using Autodesk software. And if you've ever stepped in a building, chances are it was designed with one of our softwares. So I'm actually part of the Genuine team, which is part of a cross-industry group within our marketing organization. And what we do is we use data to drive digital conversion for non-compliant users. Non-compliance is actually one of our key opportunities for growth. So our team is at the forefront of monetizing our data, specifically in this segment of users. Quickly going to go over the points that I'll be talking about today. I wanted to speak a little bit about what was the problem that we were facing and why we wanted to build this data metric framework. I'm going to talk about high level what our solution was, and then go through the steps of implementing the solution. And then finally talk about what's the impact now that we've had it for a few months. And then at the end, if you guys have any questions, we'll spend a few minutes there. So in terms of the problem, when I started on this team, because it was a relatively new team and it was growing very rapidly, and it was a really great opportunity to tap into all sorts of new data, but because it was sort of brought up in this startup vibe, we didn't really have a single source of truth for all of our KPIs. Ended up in a situation where the metrics were really calculated at the discretion of the analyst and whoever was putting together a report. So this led to a few situations where, depending on which context you refer to, what seemed to be very straightforward metrics like conversion, it could have been calculated a couple of different ways. So inevitably raises questions, well, why is this report saying conversion is X? And why is this report saying that conversion is Y? And it's not that either of the formulas were wrong. It was just a different way of looking at it. But because there was no consistency in the definition, it was difficult. You had to have all that knowledge in order to be able to decipher the metric. That was one of the main challenges. The second challenge was that the metrics themselves were not tied to business or operational goals. The function was growing very rapidly. There were certain indicators that were very important at the beginning of the program, but as the program was maturing and starting to get more sophisticated business and operational goals, we needed to transition those metrics and evolve them so that they did measure the new process properly. And then finally, the third issue that we were facing was the lack of automation. So if there were any ad hoc questions, and probably most of you who've been in any sort of analyst role, you've faced the situation where you get a relatively simple question, but because you don't have an underlying data set, you have to go build the data set, test it, do a little bit of QA, and then go back. And so something that seems a very simple and straightforward question could take up to a week to pull all the data. It was also very difficult to do deep dives. So there were a couple of attributes by which we could slice and dice the data in the original data sets. But as the function was expanding and we wanted to understand our customers a lot better, the flexibility just wasn't there with the data sets to slice it and dice it. So every time you wanted to look at the data differently, you had to build a whole new data set. Because the lack of automation wasn't there, if we wanted to share the reports with different shareholders that were not within the team, it was a little bit difficult to do that. And we didn't really have real-time results to share. And it was also an issue of permission. Some of the data was sensitive and we didn't want to share it with everyone. There were other parts of other metrics that we were fine to share with everyone. So that's the problem that we were facing. And so moving on to the solution, what we wanted to do. So what was the solution? So for the first problem, the fact that the metric calculations were the discretion of the analyst, what we decided to do was to document all the metric names and calculation in a wiki, but just going through the process of cataloging all the different metrics that we have and all the different ways that they were being calculated for the purpose of documenting, we realized that perhaps it was not necessarily, it was wrong that we were calculating conversion in two different ways because it was relevant in both contexts. We just had to find a different way, a different name for each of the scenarios and document it. So if somebody new joined the team, we would be able to say, hey, in this context, you calculated this way. In this context, you calculated this way. And all you need to know about that is on this page. The second challenge, metrics not being tied to business or operational goals, what we did is we actually looked at what are our goals for the year, what are the targets set by management, and then what do we need to measure. Obviously, things like sales and users, that's a pretty straightforward metric to tie back to goals. But if you wanted to have a prediction of how are we going to achieve those targets or not, what are some of those indicators, that's where we put in a little bit more thought and try to look at other things, including the acquisition funnel, but like the funnel in which we detected non-compliant users, so that we could predict based on the volume that we were seeing at the top of the funnel, what's going to be the volume at the bottom of the funnel. And then finally, in terms of lack of automation, we wanted to fully automate all the standard data asks and have curated dashboards. So a dashboard that was specifically for business requirements, a dashboard specifically for operational requirements. Any additional reporting that we needed would be curated in its own dashboard. And that helped remove some of the overlap that kind of happened by having all of these ad hoc reports built on top of each other. And then finally, in order to address ad hoc capabilities, we started building more robust data sets. We tried to think, okay, well, we used to look at it by country and by product, but perhaps we want to be able to drill down to city or province. So we'd add those attributes in there, even though we didn't have a specific ask to know on this how many non-compliant users we detected. We still try to think ahead of like what would be the possible asks and then built that into the data set. And then we went through 3 phases of implementing the solution. So the first phase was to essentially build the data metric framework, which ended up being a combination of a wiki page as well as a GitHub repository where all the code was documented. And the way that was done was to look at the current state. What were the metrics that were being used? What were all the reports that were being used? Where were they housed? Who owned them previously or who's owning them now? And really go through an exercise of cataloging out all this information and also documenting the SQL code that was being used in different places to calculate those metrics. From then on, as a team, we brainstormed what would be the best way to measure progress towards the business and operational goals. Then we also wanted to benchmark against what other teams were doing and how were they looking at similar processes that we had in place and try to kind of leverage best practices from them. And once we had the current state and the desired state, we looked into how we can fill in the gaps. So in some situations, we chose one definition over another, depending which definition aligned the best with our business goals. In other cases, we created new metrics for processes that weren't previously calculated or previously measured, with the goal of having a holistic picture of what are we working towards, where are we going, and what are the key levers that we have within our business processes to influence those results at the end of the day, and to be able to quantify that influence that we have through these levers that are impacting our business processes. The next phase was to actually implement it. So all was great. It's great to have it all documented. It's all great to put in all this effort, but really the hard work and the heavy lifting came when we wanted to refactor the existing pipelines and the ETL script, and we needed to add new code to address some of the gaps in reporting. So this was a very interesting exercise, and it's still ongoing because as the business is growing, as we're able to dig into the data more and more through these more robust data sets, we're starting to come up with new questions. So this exercise, even though there was a large undertaking at the beginning, it's still ongoing and it's going to continue as the business is growing and as we're learning more from our data and as we're gathering more data points. And then the second part of it was to make sure that the users were empowered to have access to this information. One of the key things that we did was to align all the existing Power BI dashboards with the framework and to remove any overlap that was there before. And also to transition prior reports that were being done in Excel, or we actually had one report that was, some of the calculations were embedded in a PowerPoint report. So all of that got moved to Power BI just to make sure that it was one source of truth, like only one place where you needed to go change the definitions. And that way it was a lot more scalable. And then we also added new content to address the gaps that we had identified in the previous exercise. So we wanted to be able to slice and dice, for example, sales by product, which used to be a very tedious exercise when this was happening in Excel. But now with Power BI, it became really easy. And then you could very easily switch between the total amount to like a share of all the products. Everything became a lot more intuitive and a lot easier to visualize. And then finally, the thing that really made a huge difference was the element of automation. So when we refactored the pipelines, we added a set of automated schedules in platform that we're using called Cubo. So these scheduled refreshes ran every night. So we were able to see more or less, and when I say real time, I'm referring to on a daily basis. I know in some contexts it could be literally real time. For us, though, going from having access to a snapshot once a month or a snapshot once a quarter to having data as of yesterday is more or less, or for us, that represented real time, especially because the decisions we were making were not necessarily would not be changing on information collected on from hour to hour. So a daily schedule was good enough. So that was for the ETL. And then the second part we did was build nightly refreshes in Power BI. And I think this was, for us, it was a really big step in the right direction because everything was synchronized and it was happening overnight. So when you came in the morning, everything was there for you. But I'm going to go into phase 3 and speak more about how these processes can evolve. As we were going through the exercise, we realized that this is not something that we're just going to do once and forget it. It's something that we needed to reassess on a quarterly basis. So set up as a team quarterly meetings to go over the metrics, assess whether they're measuring the processes the way we're hoping, or if there's any opportunities to enhance or tweak. And then this was an opportunity to revise the definitions or add new metrics and then implement the changes. And as we were going through this exercise and the data sets are growing and becoming more sophisticated, one of the things that we realized is that there's an opportunity to further align the tools that we're using to move to a stack that's a little bit more streamlined. So that's one of the opportunities that came up as we were learning this process. So intuitively, in the beginning, we felt that perhaps there's an opportunity to use a bit of a different data stack, but because we didn't really have that infrastructure, it was more like intuition. But that as we got more sophisticated, we started realizing that we need to be a bit more streamlined. So that's one of the things that is something that we're looking to do in the future. So in terms of the impact of the entire exercise, I like to say that it reduced our confusion by 99%, and that's probably the most important metric for our team. And the reason that it reduced confusion so much was that everyone had participated in this process. So it was really, really useful to have everyone's perspective on how these metrics should be calculated, to get a sense of how they're using these metrics and what kinds of decisions they're making based on this information. And when we all decided what the definitions should be, the next day, nobody came and said, oh, I'm calculating conversion like this or like that. Everybody understood. Everyone was on the same page. So it removed a lot of the back and forth of trying to figure out how did you calculate this metric versus having conversations of like, okay, this is the metric. What do we do about it? And how do we make decisions? So that was really great. The fact that we had real-time results was really useful in terms of the types of decisions we were making as a business. So if we saw that we were running a campaign that was not really generating the results that we were expecting, we could see that pretty much right away and we could start making decisions instead of waiting until the campaign ended. And then we would have to pull all the data, analyze it, and there'd be an additional analysis lag until the results were actually visible. And then the last aspect of this exercise was that it became very easy to share data with stakeholders. So one of the teams that we collaborate very closely with is the technology team who builds all the features for the tools that collect the data. It was very useful for them to have access to metrics like the detections that we're seeing and how many people we're targeting with campaigns, because that would inform what features they prioritize. And then this was also really great because it was very easy to give them access to certain dashboards and then not give them access to other dashboards where the information was a little bit more sensitive because they were so well curated and aligned, whether the metrics were related to business processes or to operational processes. That's where we are today. We still think there's an opportunity to further improve it, but I think the learnings so far for our team have been really great. Thank you for participating. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you so much, Iulia. Great talk. I know there's a few questions. I have my own company as big as Autodesk. What is the count of core KPIs that are looked at daily? I guess within your team, right? That because you probably don't have like visibility of the whole organization.
We're a very unique team because we were almost like a startup within the bigger organization. So we started out with a couple of key metrics that were really around understanding the impact of the software that we were creating to capture this information. But as we started moving from a prototype type of program to a more established business who actually contributes to sales, then we started getting more sophisticated in terms of the numbers of KPIs that we look at. So right now we have 3 KPIs that we look at. And then in terms of metrics, I never actually sat down to count them, but I think we have probably about 10 metrics that help us understand the drivers that impact our KPIs.
All right. In your presentation, you said that you decided which definition you were going to use for metrics. I was personally interested to know if your team made that decision, the owner, or if it was more of a collegial decision.
The program's really small at this point, and the team is relatively small and very diverse. The team does own the metrics right now. The way we made decisions about the definitions, kind of a trade-off between the data that was available, the effort that we needed to put into relative to the degree of the sophistication for the metrics. And also we try to benchmark against what other teams were using. The challenge that we ran into is that we were measuring things in a cumulative way, whereas other teams were measuring more based on activity. So we were just looking at like the total number of users that we detected, whereas other teams were looking at the active users. And we had business reasons to do it differently. And at the end of the day, that made more sense for the business that we were doing at the time. But now as we're scaling and we're starting to test different campaign options, we're starting to think that maybe we want to morph those measures to align more with what's being done in other departments.
Thank you for that. And I have a follow-up question, if I may. I know you said that this is going to be an iterative process, right? You're going to be on a quarterly basis. I think you said you're going to be reviewing and assessing and maybe changing. If you change a metric, it's going to obviously impact business because they're going to have new numbers or it's going to be changing. So how do you propose you're going to be managing this change of metric, the change of definition?
That's a very good question. A lot of the conversations that are happening right now are with other teams. So the change would not be because our team wants to change things for the sake of changing things. It's more an effort to align with similar business processes. So it wouldn't necessarily, yes, there would be an element of restatement, but it wouldn't be like the same metric we just completely calculated differently. If the difference is significant or material, then we would just create a new metric. If the difference is not material, but it's more of a nuance, so it gives us more precision, in that case, we would just share that or update it in the wiki, update the GitHub, and then share that with the people that are using the dashboards just to give them a heads up and have some sort of reconciliation. I think we actually did that for one of the metrics, and we had a reconciliation between like, this is how we used to calculate it before, this is how we calculate it now, this is what's causing the difference. And like people having that ability to see it side by side help them embrace the new metric a lot easier.
And that was in the documentation that you had all that?
I think for the reconciliation, there was actually a tab in one of the reports because it was just showing the calculations. But in the documentation, there's also like a tracker to say, this quarter we made this change, this quarter we made this change. So if you ever go back to maybe a management report from 2 quarters ago, and then you're able to say, oh, we reported this before we added this new rule. So it's a lot easier to justify where the discrepancies are coming from.
Like a change log, essentially.
Yeah, essentially.
I might have missed this, but Iulia, how long, like what was the time frame of everything that you've described in your presentation?
So the first phase took about a month, and the first phase meaning building the documentation, cataloging all that we had, brainstorming where we wanted to get, and filling in the gaps. And then the implementation part, I would say, took about a quarter. So yeah, all in all, from start to finish, it was about 4 months, but it's been evolving continuously. And then by the end of the quarter of build, we actually had to produce a report for senior management. And one of the challenges that we had in the past was that we couldn't really do deep dives because it was just not feasible from a time perspective. But this time we were able to do it. So all of a sudden we were able to create all of these new graphs, slice and dice the data literally on the spot as we were talking through all the different questions, which was a huge win for us because we were then able to answer a lot of questions that in the past we just didn't have data available to do it.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks, Iulia.